So with that in mind, just a few words, what I bring to you today, the experience I bring, I've done quite a few things and I'm involved in various projects. I actually used to work at different EU institutions for 7 years. And for about 6 years, I've been working extensively on projects, namely the EU training, which is a website and a service where we help you prepare for EU careers and permanent EU jobs. But apart from that, I'm also director of an organization called Public Affairs Council. It's essentially dealing with public affairs with over 700 organizations as members. So I'll bring you that perspective of how you can maximize your chances to find a job in the private sector in European affairs. And I have a book called Ultimate EU Textbook, which again helps you find a career. And there's a new project, a side project, but it's getting more important in my life, called Speaker Hub. It's not related to the EU, but that's for those who are interested in giving public speeches, and our speakers or trainers, they can market themselves as such to conference organizers. So with that in mind, so the EU training community is a pretty robust one. We've had over the past almost 10 years, 8,000 users who used our service. So if you're interested in getting a career, I urge you to sign up, because we share an incredible amount of information on Facebook and through email and tips and tricks and career advice if you are connected to us. And then we have all sorts of online tests. Millions of tests have been used, and we have several hundreds of hours of webinars. A lot of them are free, which help candidates prepare for these competitions that European institutions announce. So with that in mind, basically I'm going to structure my presentation today into two main parts. The first is about career advice and finding a career in European affairs at large. And then the second part will focus very specifically on the EPSO procedure. EPSO stands for European Personal Selection Office. So that's the organization, the service of the European institutions that helps find new staff. Or more specifically, they are the ones who administer the selection competitions, which are a prerequisite for you to get an EU job. So there is a recording. So as far as I'm aware, Greta will distribute the recording if you want to watch it again, or there are some parts made which you'd like to revise. And the disclaimer is that I'm not an EU official anymore, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the institutions. So the official source of information is always what comes from the European institutions. So make sure to look that up. And of course, what I'm saying now is valid as of today, but the system might slightly change in the future if you happen to be listening to this as a recording. So strategic approach when it comes to career. And I understand that a lot of you are not necessarily European citizens, which might somewhat limit your possibilities when it comes to finding a job at EU institutions, but it doesn't really limit your opportunities of finding a job outside the institutions in European affairs. Before anything else, obviously, as any career seeker or any job seeker would know, that your goal is really to be that red apple, the one that stands out, the one that gets noticed by the potential employer at a position that you are really, really looking for. So standing out, and it's very easy to say, but I'm going to give you a couple of ideas how you can do that and how you can maximize your chances of being picked. And the number one goal is really convincing the employer with your CV or resume for American English speakers and motivation letter to invite you to an interview. And it's really optimizing that resume or CV and the letter to get that interview. And usually, once you have that, your chances are skyrocketing. Then your chances are much, much better than being among the many or hundreds, sometimes thousands of applicants that are looking for a job. So the number one thing you want to do is finding your USP, finding your unique selling proposition or position. And the number one thing could be knowledge of the EU, or maybe you have a specialty at CEU which deals with some development policy, or maybe you're dealing with Central Asia. So replace that EU part with a very specific knowledge that you have, and it easily can set you apart, because there are many applicants who are desiring a job in European careers, but they don't necessarily have that technical knowledge or the detailed background that you have as a result of your studies. Number two, international network. That's often underrated or forgotten by job seekers, that it actually is an asset on its own. When you apply for a job, the simple fact that you're studying where you are studying right now certainly puts you in a great position, because you've already developed international network. So if, let's say, you're looking for a job at a European Trade Association, and they would like to apply for EU funds, and for those funds you need a network, you need to find local partners in different European countries or neighboring countries, your network is already something you can leverage and something you can highlight in your application. Understanding policy and politics. A lot of people claim they do, very few actually do. And again, given your studies and given your specialty, this is something where you can back up that sort of claim. Languages, again, often not sufficiently underlined in applications. When I speak with colleagues, friends in different parts of, or let's say working in different positions, very often they would look for obviously English and or French and or German, but then they would value the fact that somebody speaks a relatively unique language. So if you're coming from Georgia, if you're coming from Romania, if you're coming from any other, say, Central Eastern European country, your language might actually be a plus. It might actually be a good thing that you have that linguistic, because again, if there's a project, if there's a local partner for a diplomatic body, or if you're working for a think tank which does work in a given region, the language is a plus. A good friend of mine just told me she will start working soon for an international NGO here in Brussels, and the fact that she speaks Ukrainian, Russian, and another language, in Central Asian language, that's a big plus. That was one of the main reasons why she got the job. And then subject matter expertise, obviously, is something you'd like to highlight, which is relevant to the job description. And another thing that you may want to leverage in your application is a brand. And by brand, Central European University has a great brand, very good one. If you've done some research project for Google's Bulgaria team, that's great. That's another brand that really stands out, helps you with a more unique profiling, or the kind of project that you worked on, or certain studies that you've done before coming to this university. All of this needs to be in your application to succeed. Now, more specifically, let's look at a couple of job opportunities, or the types of jobs that you could apply for. When it comes to EU institutions, essentially, we could talk about three main categories, so to say. Now, I'm simplifying here, but you can definitely look up more detailed explanations. We've even produced a video to explain how EU jobs work in practice that you can find on eutraining.eu. But for the sake of today's conversation, in a nutshell, when EU institutions hire new staff, they normally will turn to EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office, to administer those exams. And those exams are not recruitment exams. And there's a bit of terminology here. These are not recruitment exams. These are selection exams, hence the S in the EPSO abbreviation. So their task is to administer a series of tests and selection exams, at the end of which you will be placed on a so-called reserve list. And once you're on the reserve list, you are recruitable. So EPSO doesn't recruit, EPSO selects. Now, EPSO administers most of the exams the most, which are prerequisite for permanent EU jobs. So to get a permanent contract as a competition lawyer, or get a permanent contract as a political advisor, or permanent contract as a lawyer linguist or patent expert, normally, as a main rule, EPSO would be the one running those selection exams. So whenever EPSO announces a new exam, and this year we're expecting about, well, it's hard to say, but I'd say 20, 30 different types of exams are likely going to be announced, it's going through them. The number two I highlighted here is the so-called caste exams. Now, this has nothing to do with the caste system in India. This is definitely about contract agent selection tests. So that's what caste stands for. And these are for, as the name suggests, contract agents which are of determinate or specific fixed duration. So these would typically be 2 or 3 year contracts. Usually it's extendable by another 2 years. It's as a main rule, it's for limited duration. Interestingly enough, these are now also administered by EPSO. They just announced these contract agent exams a couple days ago, where they are collecting a pool of candidates who need to register in a database, and then they would do selection tests based on need. And then there's a third type where you have the EU agencies. Now, EU agencies are pretty abundant. There's even one in Budapest, and scattered all over Europe. Like in Parma, you have the European Food Safety Authority or the European Medicines Agency in London, though we don't know how long that's going to stay there in light of Brexit. But there are agencies which are linked to European institutions. They also employ a large number of staff, which are typically under temporary agent contracts. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail, the difference between contract agent and temporary agent. Suffice to say, it's limited duration contracts. So, bottom line, if you would like to work at EU institutions, the path is most likely through EPSO. So you need to sit some sort of EPSO exam, and you need to register through the EPSO. And one important thing, that in 99% of the cases, you need to be an EU citizen to work for European institutions. On the other hand, there's the other large group of jobs, especially in Brussels, the diplomatic jobs. And diplomatic jobs, I put here perm reps, and that's the lingo for permanent representations. So all of the 28 EU member states would have a permanent representation, and interestingly, all other countries and nations of the world would also have their representation in Brussels. These are usually called missions. So there could be the Russian mission to the EU, the US mission to the EU, and these are accredited to EU institutions. So depending on your citizenship, depending on where you're coming from, you might want to look at the diplomatic channel because of your knowledge of the EU or knowledge of European studies, that they might be interested in your profile to be eventually posted in Brussels. But the path to these postings, it's usually through your own capital. So because these are diplomatic jobs, sometimes they might require that you pass your national diplomatic exam. Sometimes they don't require that because your profile just fits what they are looking for, or they need a trade expert and you happen to be that. So that can vary, but the bottom line, usually the path to Brussels goes through your capital. Now, SNEs, these are, again, an abbreviation, the seconded national experts. And these are often, they have the status either of a diplomat or a civil servant who are posted in Brussels. And sometimes they're posted to their diplomatic outpost, so the mission, or in the case of EU member states, to the permanent representations, sometimes specifically to EU institutions. So the European Commission has a couple dozen, maybe a couple hundred of seconded national experts who are civil servants, say Dutch or Finnish or Maltese, and they are posted to work for a certain number of years at EU institutions specifically, because they bring a national perspective, they bring a national expertise. Now, there you have the political jobs. Political jobs, at least my way of grouping them, you could be an assistant to a member of the European Parliament. So European Parliament has 751 MEPs, members of parliament, and every single one of them would employ 2, 3, sometimes 4 assistants. This is not on the scale of US Congress, where a congressman would typically have an office with 30, 40, 50 staff, but still 3 or 4, you do the maths and you get to roughly 2,000 jobs, which are linked to individual MEPs, and it's their decision who they hire. Now, the parliamentary groups, that's the EP, European parliamentary groups, they have their own secretariat. So you would have the European People's Party, you would have the Socialists and Democrats, you would have the Liberals, you would have the Greens, you would have all sorts of European parliamentary groups whose own secretariat also employs a number of staff. And again, if you happen to be coming from a Middle East country and there is interest by a member of parliament in your country or in your region, that could be a good fit. They are not limited to EU citizens, and it's an open-ended thing that they like your profile and they find that a good fit. Advocacy organizations, I also put them as political because similarly to the previous ones, you need to be aligned to the values, the worldview, the political priorities of that particular person or organization. So whether it's Greenpeace or Amnesty International or a coalition for privacy and data protection, whatever it may be, these are semi-political organizations, very often NGOs or civil society organizations that employ a large number of people. And then you have the fourth group, obviously the largest, the private sector, and this is not about the local market in Belgium, but this is about private sector working with European institutions or working on European affairs. And that can include think tanks like the European Policy Center, like Bruegel, which is an economic think tank, and a number of other think tanks, the German Marshall Fund, which is semi-think tank, semi-advocacy organization. You have consultancies, which typically employ anything between 5 to all the way 60, 70, 80 staff. Like FTI Consulting is a pretty big one these days, Fleischmann-Hillard, you have Edelman, you have Interel. There's a number of consultancies that are dealing with public affairs, lobbying, advocacy, and related things. And then you have trade associations. Trade associations are abundant in this town. And even though they don't tend to employ a large number of staff, they typically have anything between 5 and 15 staff for whether it's communication, whether it's very specific sectoral policy, or it could be trade related, it could be regulatory affairs. It really, really varies. Trade association, there are some really funny ones. I'm trying to recall. Once I wanted to collect the funniest trade associations, but I didn't want to hurt any sensitivities. But I think the European Heat Pump Association probably qualifies as one of the more interesting ones. And don't ask me what heat pumps are for, but certainly engineers on this call would know. But then you have from photovoltaic, so basically for solar panels, you have trade associations for the car industry, and you might even come up with an idea for trade associations. The more entrepreneurials among you might want to create a trade association if you have an expertise in a certain field, in self-driving cars or drones or any other field, which is an emerging technology. Bottom line, private sector is pretty robust. There are estimates of anything between 10,000 and 40,000 lobbyists working around European institutions. And again, I use the term lobbyist very loosely and broadly because any interest representative would qualify as such. So this gives you a rough idea of the types of jobs you can find. And here are a couple of points how you could increase your chances of getting picked and landing a job. Now, before I go to these ideas, one hint you might want to look at. There is the European Joint Transparency Register. So you might want to look that up. That's some people call the lobby register. Basically, any organization, association, private company that wants to lobby European institutions is strongly advised to register there. Otherwise, they cannot have access to policymakers. But for the job seeker, that's a fantastic resource because you can start searching that directory and trying to find organizations that you may have never heard about, but it can be very helpful and relevant for your job seeking exercise. So the Joint Transparency Register is something you can search and look for. And then when you find an employer, what are they going to ask? Well, the number one thing they're going to ask, maybe they don't ask that straight to your face or through email, but it's going to be in their head. Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the relevant knowledge that I need? And I've seen hundreds of CVs and cover letters. And very often when there's an application, the applicant would just not communicate that properly. So they might say, well, I've studied here, I've studied there, but their knowledge may not be relevant to that particular organization. Number two, let's really do a good job. First, they're not going to ask you this way, but that's something they will be considering. How can you, and think long and hard, how can you sort of prove or underline in your email, cover letter, resume, that you're going to do a good job? You can sort of prove it by publications you've done, by references that you can gather, by track record that you can convey to them that you are going to be good in the job. Will you be a good fit? Again, this is a, well, I hear this expression from Americans mostly, but Europeans may not be so, let's say, they wouldn't put these exact words, but they would have the same consideration. I'll give you a very personal example. In our company, we are a very small team. And when we were hiring, we were very much thinking, if a person comes here and wants to work with us, we need to make sure that that person is able to work in a small office with a small team. So if you fit better in a large organization because you like procedures and processes and you like that certain things have their own responsible manager, that culturally, meaning corporate culture, that might not be a good fit. So that's a very important consideration. And EU institutions, they are large institutions. So you need to make sure that if you apply to the European Parliament, you try to convey that message that you can fit into a complex and often bureaucratic institution. If you apply to a trade association, you need to convey the message that you're going to be good working in a relatively small team, that you have a right level of independence. And then there's number four, can it work out? Can it work out in practical terms that if you are not an EU citizen, which again is perfectly fine when applying for a job, you still want to make sure that the potential employer doesn't have second thoughts, and they're not going to ask themselves, saying, well, here's an Albanian citizen, and her profile is just perfect. But I have doubts whether the work permit, the local just administration, wouldn't that make some extra time for me? Wouldn't that cause some administrative burden? If you can upfront answer that question saying, well, I'm a long-term resident in Hungary, which gives me a right to work in other parts of Europe. That could be just one thing, seems minor, but immediately you took away an anxiety that a potential employer would have. And if there are dozens and dozens of candidates, and one of them might be just more headache in administrative terms, employer, they just take the easier path. So all of these questions you need to answer in your application to be successful. And then a couple of ideas how to get the dream job. And I give you 7 sort of principles. Now, we're in the number one, value at the crossroads. You've got this weird image of a tiger and the lion, and why the hell did I put it there? Well, the answer is, if you have a background, let's say, in engineering, and you studied European affairs, now that's a very interesting mix, because engineering and European affairs can lend you a great job at a car manufacturer's Brussels representation, because you actually know the engineering stuff and you know the politics around it as well. It could be a language that you have and another experience you gain. You say, going back to my previous example, so if you speak, say, fluent Russian, and at the same time you're dealing with the Western Caucasus, and you studied international politics, that could be a very unique mix, which makes you an ideal candidate for that sort of job. So try to find those hidden or relatively untapped pieces of information. And if you mix those two, there could be immense value. And if you manage to highlight that to a potential employer, bingo, you landed a job. Number two is do pay a lot of attention to soft skills. A lot of candidates, I know from first-hand experience, a lot of candidates tend to focus purely on what they know, and they tend to forget to talk about their soft skills. And soft skills being their presentation skills, their creative writing skills, their how elaborate you are in a foreign language, that you're able to do excellent teamwork. These sort of things tend to sit at the very end, in the very back of your CV, and sort of hidden. But employers are more and more looking for this. Again, if you apply for a job at a European Trade Association, chances are they will need to do a lot of events or organize a lot of political discussions. You highlight that you participated at a moot court competition, you participated in a negotiation simulation exercise. These things should not be hidden. They are very, very important. And my personal example here is that why I put here College of Europe. Back then, when I applied to the College of Europe, where I pursued a degree in European public administration, at the interview, I was not the best candidate by far. I did not know the most, for sure. But I still got in, and I had a chance to talk to one of the members of the jury who told me afterwards, well, Mr. Baneth, the thing is, you knew enough for us to consider you. You certainly didn't know the most, but generally you came across as someone who likes to communicate, who seems to be getting along with others well. So that was an important factor for us to consider you. This is not about me. This is about passing the message that soft skills can play an important role in you landing a job, and not just the pure technical knowledge that you have. Next thing is, there's this famous presentation by a guy called Dan Pink. Worth looking it up. He gave a very, very good TED talk, 15, 20 minutes, where he essentially outlined the following, that what you are looking for as a job seeker would sit somewhere in the middle of these three concepts, or of the three circles of this Venn diagram. And essentially, there are three things to consider. What is your desired level of autonomy? It goes back to my earlier point. If you're looking for a job in a two-person team because you would be the Brussels representatives of the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, and they have a 10-person team, they probably would require you have a lot of autonomy. But if you feel more comfortable in a large organization, maybe your level or required level of autonomy might be smaller. But definitely autonomy in your work is an important consideration. Number two would be mastery, that you want to get better at your job. And if the job you're looking for may not offer that, you probably wouldn't be happy there. Probably you don't want to do that. So that's a consideration you would have. And then number three, that the job you're looking for should have some sort of purpose. And a lot of people who are working in institutions today really work there because of that factor, that they believe in the European integration project, that they are very driven by something beyond the mundane salary and office and the kind of work environment in which they are, because they see the purpose. And again, if these three, the right combination of these three happen, you will find a good job. But then again, employers are thinking the same way. If I'm an advocacy organization, if I'm the World Wildlife Fund, I probably want someone who cares deeply about environmental issues and someone who takes it seriously to argue for that, and not just someone who feels good in a small office and can learn about advocacy issues, because that would be autonomy fine, mastery fine, but what about the purpose? So you want to highlight each of these elements in one way or another in your job application to make sure that you get hired. Next thing is, don't make me think. This is from a web design book, but I love the message, which so much comes back when I look at applications and cover letters. So you see, I give you an example here. I don't know how legible that is on the screen for those who are a little further away, but let me read it out. So it says, "Dear Mr. Smith, I'm applying for the position of an EU consultant at your association. I graded from CEU, and I speak fluent English and German apart from my native Swedish. I've got 3 years of experience in EU affairs, and I'm just completing a traineeship at the European Commission." What is wrong with this cover letter? Well, the problem that this cover letter makes the employer think, in the sense that it makes them, it requires from them a lot of cognitive process, a lot of cognitive effort to connect your profile with what they are looking for. But this is something you can do for them. This is something you can anticipate. And here's the sort of a better version of the same message. "Dear Mr. Smith, I believe my diploma from CEU can be a great asset to your company, hence I'm submitting my job application." You see the change of tone, that you're not just sort of saying what you are and what you do, but how you can contribute to them. This is classic sales technique that you want to apply for your job application. That being fluent in English and German, along with the traineeship I'm just finishing at the Commission, this can prove beneficial when your association interacts with members of the European Parliament, whose support, as I understood from your website, are crucial for the dossiers you tackle. So the coin has been totally flipped. The message, the approach has been totally flipped, because they say, how can you help them reach their goals? So you don't make them think, you don't get them to do that exercise, you do it for them. And here's the next thing. Abstraction is for painters. You don't want to be abstract. You want to be very, very concrete. So when I see cover letters, when I see resumes that says, "I know many languages, I'm an expert in EU environmental policy, I have several years of experience working on structural funds," this is very, very poor writing. It's not going to get you far. You need to be far more specific. You need to put there the program name, the regional funds name, the budget you worked on, the number of people you've worked together, how many people did you manage. You need to be far more specific, because otherwise the message will just simply not resonate with those employers. And then you have the last one, jargon. We all speak in jargon. I already told you a few, from EPSO to second national expert, the SNE. Jargon very often can be EU jargon, it can be abbreviations, it can be industry jargon. Be very careful. So if you are positive that the person reading the file will know that. So again, going back to a previous example, if you're dealing with, say, Central Asian development projects, and you're applying for a job at the World Bank office in Brussels, maybe you want to use jargon because it creates that language, that connection with those folks who are using those every day. So they say, oh, here's someone who's dealing with the same projects I've been dealing with. So that can create a lot of rapport, a lot of good connection. Otherwise, if it's a hiring manager, because it's a larger company, let's say Bayer, and Bayer is a large pharmaceutical chemical company, maybe HR would manage an application not in Brussels, but in their central office. They have no clue whatsoever about the EU jargon. So think very carefully which one you're using. Is it going to help your cause, or it's really going to hurt you? And then the last one, of internet being a friend or foe, make sure that your LinkedIn profile is optimized and it's in sync with your resume or CV that you're sending out. Make sure that you link into the PDF of your application the thesis that you've written, or the background, or any sort of presentation you've given. Put it on SlideShare, put it on online platforms to showcase how you talk about complex issues, how you present, how you mention these things. So all of this together in the EU context, hopefully gives you a good head start of how you can approach that in terms of which the kind of jobs that, or the kind of sectors or areas that are available, and how you would approach the application. Now, having said that, let me spend a couple minutes and then we'll open it up for questions very briefly about the EPSO procedure for those of you who are interested very specifically working for EU institutions as mostly as a civil servant. So the number one thing, the number one question is always eligibility. Eligibility, do you have the formal criteria to qualify as a candidate? And that's always written in a notice of competition. As I said before, in almost all cases, you need to be citizen of the EU's 28 member states, and you need to have completed military service if that's compulsory in your country. I don't think that's the case in any EU country. And you need to have sort of the right morals for the job. So hopefully you're not a convicted criminal who would like to get into the institutions. So these are just pretty basic formal criteria, but then sometimes for specialist competitions. So sometimes EPSO would announce competitions for, let's say, intellectual property lawyers, or they might announce a competition for nuclear scientists, literally nuclear scientists. So sometimes they would have these very specific ones. In those cases, they would require you to have a degree, a diploma, a qualification, which is relevant to that field. In most other cases, all you need to do, or you need to have, is have a generic degree, basically a bachelor's degree would be the minimum requirement. And then in some cases, and again, I'm giving you sort of a high-level overview, depends again on the exam. In some cases, they might do some pre-screening. So for the contract agent exams that are happening now, they do a pre-screening of the candidates. For specialist exams, there's a so-called talent screener. That's basically a survey or like a question and an answer sheet you need to fill in. And based on that, they check whether you really have the right number of years of experience or the relevant profile or publications. But generalist exams, basically everybody sits the test. So there's no pre-screening, but there is a so-called pre-selection. So pre-selection tests essentially mean three types of tests: the verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, and abstract reasoning. And then again, I put in brackets the competency test. It's for specialist exams or for the contract agent exams. But for the almost all exams, you need the magic three, the so-called psychometric tests. And these are administered in language one. Language one is your sort of mother tongue, well, as long as it's an EU official language. Currently, there are 24 EU official languages, and you need to pick one of those. So I could pick Hungarian. If I spoke Greek, I could pick Greek. But I speak fairly good English. I could pick English as well. But for the second part of the second stage of the competitions, you need to pick English, French, or German, and it has to be different from language one. So if I were to take language one as English, I would be limited to French or German as language two. Since my German is extremely limited, my French is pretty good, but I wouldn't necessarily want to have an exam in that language. I would then go for language one as Hungarian, language two, English. And then just to give you a snapshot, so the verbal reasoning is basically a test where there's a text passage, a question, there are 4 statements and only one correct answer. And you see the timing, it's pretty harsh time pressure. You've got 20 questions and you need to answer those in 30 seconds. And they're trying to confuse you and they're trying to put pressure. But those of you who have done GMAT exams, you would know these type of questions. There's a very, very strict time limit and a similar approach to it. Number 2 is the numerical reasoning. Numerical reasoning, again, easy to compare to GMAT. You've got a table, a chart with numbers and figures, and you need to interpret that and reason and estimate and calculate. Again, 10 questions in 20 minutes, a pretty tough thing to do, but you have a calculator that you can use. And then you have an abstract reasoning, which is the one you see on the screen, with all sorts of figures and shapes moving, spinning, and turning, and you need to find a way how, or find the next one in the sequence. And here again, time pressure is insane. It's 10 questions and 10 minutes. So that's why we always compare this to sports, that most people who are in good physical shape can run 100 meters, but they cannot necessarily do that under 10 seconds. And to be able to come close to that, you need to practice. Simple as that. You need to practice and you need to find a good methodology. And that's something you can certainly do. And then the so-called competency tests, these are not typical. Let's say these are more exceptional for the CAST exams, and these are very often about your knowledge of law, knowledge of public policy, knowledge of EU affairs. So that's a little exceptional there. But for this one, you have more time, 25 questions in 50 minutes, so 2 minutes per question. That's a bit of a luxury. So this gives you a rough idea of the pre-selection test. So pre-selection test is where thousands and thousands of candidates are trying to pass those, because their goal is to get to the assessment center. And assessment center, it's usually a one-day series of exams, which includes a case study, an oral presentation, a so-called group exercise, a competency-based interview, and a specialist interview, specialist exam. Now, there's a lot to be said about the assessment center, and you can find tons of free ebooks on eutraining.eu. You can find tips and tricks. You can find a lot of information. For the sake of today's discussion, enough to say that this is sort of the second phase of the selection process. And in some sense, it's even a fun exercise because they really test your skills, your competencies from so many angles. And then if all goes well, you get on the reserve list, and then recruitment can happen. So that's when actually the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Court of Auditors in Luxembourg, or the Court of Justice, they can all tap into that database and extend an offer to you. So this is it in a nutshell in terms of working for institutions or working with the institutions, meaning in diplomatic bodies, in think tanks, in private sector or other fields. And I think this is where I'll stop and open up for questions. So, great talk, back to you.
Okay, do you hear us?
Yes, but I think it would make sense that you perhaps repeat whatever questions there might be, unless there's a microphone.
Okay, so are there any questions? Just please raise your hand. Yes?
Yeah, for those of us that are graduating in June, is there a sort of recommended time that we should start looking for jobs?
Did you hear
Okay. Yeah, so recommended time looking for jobs. Well,
specifically outside of EU institutions, since I'm not an EU national.
Right.
EU national.
In relation to your studies, that's an open thing because it depends on when you graduate. But at least in Brussels, not just institutions, but also the private sector tends to be in complete summer vacation mode as of early July all the way until early September. So that's typically a dead zone, and you don't want to start looking for jobs from July or August until early or mid-September until it starts picking up. In relation to your studies or your degree, well, it all depends whether you're a full-time student or you're part-time, but that's pretty personal. And again, in terms of when during the year, I think, yeah, it's very hard to say. Let's say if you're dealing with environment policy or environment law, and maybe there's some major political event happening, whether it's COP21 or now it's COP22, or it could be Commission initiative, chances are there's going to be more interest in experts who understand that field. So you can be very timely with your application if there's some political development in a given field. Now, there are a lot of consultants being hired in the context of Brexit. Obviously, it has to be more sectoral. Someone might deal with trade, someone might deal with more political issues. So that, again, could be a good time to put in an application.
Another question? No? Yep.
Certain European institutions like the European Investment Bank have job postings on their own websites, I think for contract agents. How do they select their future
Right. Now, you mentioned the European Investment Bank, the EIB, and that's a little bit of a special case. So they tend to be, let's say, go their own way, and they would not go through EPSO. So they would typically have their own HR department that would run the selection process, which is often unique to them. So it would be in their notice of vacancy or the vacancy notice where they say, well, here is the process through which we're going to hire new staff. Meaning, first we do a CV screening, and if you pass that, we might have you to sit for, say, numerical reasoning test. We want you to take a case study about some investment-related issue. We're going to evaluate that, and eventually we're going to invite you to an interview. So agencies in general, and the European Investment Bank in particular, and actually even the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, they tend to have their own selection systems. And we did a pretty comprehensive study on how agencies and other institutions run their processes. So we did a research, we called them up, we tried to get information. That's on our website, but very transparently, it's a little dated. So we did that 2 or 3 years ago, so the information may not be relevant. But in any case, it's always in the vacancy notice that they need to disclose the kind of exams that they require of you. And if you're uncertain, we're always happy to help. So shoot me an email, we'll look at it, and we try to interpret that in the context of what we've heard, what we've seen, and our experience.
Thank you for that. Other questions? Yeah.
What would you suggest for the PhD students who have a specific type of knowledge/expertise?
Did you hear?
Yes, I did, and I'm thinking. It's hard to say a generic answer for that. So it depends whether how, the thing is how theoretical that is, how practical that is. And I think it's always a challenge with those with PhD. Let's say PhD could be very applicable if you want to stay in the research field. So you have, let's say the European Commission has a joint research center, which is part of the European Commission, and they tend to hire a large number of researchers. And that could be social studies or social sciences, that could be engineering, that could be biochemistry, and many others. I'll give you another example. I have a good friend, he's a researcher. He's actually a biochemist. He used to work in academia and conducted a lot of research projects. But he was recently hired by one of the EU's agencies called Research Executive Agency. And what they do, basically he switched sides on the table because he's no longer the one soliciting funds for research projects, but he's the one who's evaluating those applications, tender applications. So they certainly appreciate his understanding, his deep understanding of the subject matter, because he knows what sort of criteria he needs to look at to evaluate a certain project. So PhD you can pursue research, or you can leverage your subject matter expertise when it comes to, say, tenders or EU projects. And I said, so these are basically the two main areas that come to mind: the Research Executive Agency and the Joint Research Center.
But then that doesn't go through EPSO, it goes through...
Again, normally it does, but it depends. It depends. So the system is getting a little more complex these days. So the more, let's say, the more unique, the more specialist the profile is, the less likely it is that it goes through EPSO. So if they really want, say, 2 new staff who are into social science research or sociology or social anthropology or something like that, they're not going to go through EPSO. They can announce a temporary agent position, and they would just simply accept applications and evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. If the selection process is more large-scale, that they want to hire 10, 15, 20, 50 new staff in a given field, then they would normally go to EPSO.
Thank you. There is one question from an online participant.
Yeah.
So the question is, how long are we on the reserve list once we've passed the EPSO exam, EPSO process? Is there a limit of time during which we can be offered?
Right. Now, as I mentioned before, the ultimate goal of the EPSO process is that you end up on the reserve list. And from the reserve list, you still need to be recruited. How long you're there and how long the reserve list itself is valid? Well, normally 1 year if it's a result of a competition that happens every year. So if it's a generalist competition, the rule of thumb, the normal rule would be that it's valid for 1 year. If it's a specialist competition, it would be valid for longer, usually 2, 3, sometimes even up to 5 years. And within that time frame, you can be hired. So you could get a job offer that maybe you're not very happy with, and you can decline. Or you don't get a job offer for a couple of months, and you only get it for 1 year. That's also a possibility. But as long as the reserve list is valid, you can be hired. And to EPSO's credit, these days, I don't have exact statistics, but something like 80, 85% of those on the reserve list would get hired eventually. And you might ask, what about the 15%? Well, sometimes they themselves, their life circumstances have changed, they moved, they're no longer interested. So sometimes it does come from the participant that they wouldn't be hired.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I would like to know, like, what are the opportunities for PhD students in philosophy and who is from India in Europe?
Did you hear a very specific question about PhD in philosophy from India?
Doing in Europe, in Syria.
Now that's talking about value at the crossroads. Now there's a lot of value there. And I think the challenge obviously is finding which organization would be interested in that profile. And well, if you take India, obviously there are a lot of organizations who have, whether trade relations, whether it's political issues with India, so that you could highlight that angle. Philosophy, well, that's a tougher one, because in this political and policy environment, philosophy might be a difficult sell. Might be a difficult sell, to be very honest. But then again, maybe it's the research angle, maybe it's another one that you can.
Okay, and what are the opportunities for software engineers in Europe who are from India?
Software engineer.
Yes.
Well, I think that Andras is not really a recruitment expert of software engineering, but if you have any tips there,
Anything
welcome.
for like where to look for jobs in Europe? Like the website?
Any websites for jobs in European institutions or European affairs, and I think that should be the last question.
Yes, the last question, and I know it's late and some of you need to go. So I'm very happy. I'll send you, as a follow-up, I'll send you the link to the presentation, and I'll send you some links that you can screening and trying to assemble open positions. So I'll send you the link to that one as well, and a couple of other websites that you can look at.
Your name. I have a sheet of paper there. Piece of paper. So I'm going to send you the presentation and all information that Andras would like to share with you. And I saw one last question.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have time for one last question?
Just a quick one.
To make sure, so I'm very happy to answer your questions. Send me a mail, and Greta will be sharing that with you. So if you have anything related to EPSO or careers or other, maybe I won't answer very fast, but I will answer eventually. So feel free.
Then I will then last question, or
Yeah, last question.
Okay.
one last question.
Andras,
and then we are done.
Andras, what do you think? What will be the most developing part as we think as the EU institutions in terms of staff? What would be the most developing part if we're looking further to the next couple of years?
Which one the most?
Developing, imagine.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there is, given the dynamics of European politics these days, I think The European Commission would always need to hire hundreds and hundreds of staff. I give you just one piece of statistic. I probably should have included it in my presentation. But looking at the number of staff that's going to retire in the next couple of years, something like 40% of the staff will reach retirement age. So even if EU institutions have no intention to expand the number of staff, and even if they reduce it by 5%, they still need hundreds and hundreds of staff, almost thousands of new staff each year just to maintain their core operation. So Commission is always a good employer to look at in the future. And then also in national capitals. So I think EU experts will be in demand because just simply the dynamics of European affairs in all ministries of foreign affairs, justice ministries, trade ministries, and the like. So that's definitely a place to look at.